We are the Muslim Ummah, and each day that goes by, the harder we try. In gratitude we pray to Allah. Chosen as part of the best of mankind, we spread the word of Islam. Every difficulty faced in our lives makes us realize that it's just part of Allah's plan. Feeling stronger, we take it in our stride.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to this exciting journey which we started 21 episodes ago. We are now on episode 21. I'm Dr. Stef Keris, the author of The Forgotten Ottoman Heritage of Europe, the editor-in-chief of ilmonlinemag.com, a lecturer in several universities in Europe and in Africa, and we have had the chance to look into a variety of countries until now. We have had the chance to look into the historical spread of Islam, and we have come to the point to look now into the more modern aspect of the spread of Islam in the world, and especially in the western parts of the world, and we're looking into the western cultural parts of the world, because Australia does not necessarily belong to the West as according to the geography, but according to its cultural background, it's part of the Western Hemisphere. So we looked into Australia in the last episode, and we saw that Islam in Australia, the modern Australia from the 19th, 20th century on, had been brought to Australia by Muslims, mainly from the Balkan Peninsula, and then in the 60s also from Turks. Muslims from Bosnia and Albania formed the biggest two groups in Australia. Before 1967, the first Turks arrived, and Australia copied basically the way that Germany dealt with Turkey. That time in the 60s, Germany signed guest workers agreement, Gastarbeiter agreement, between these two countries, Germany and Turkey, and Australia did exactly the same, and quite some Turks came over to settle in Australia. This brought a third group of Muslims, white, more or less, white people who came to Australia, but the policy towards non-whites changed after the 70s, and then people from all over the world had the chance to enter Australia, especially from Asia, seeing that, of course, the closest parts of the world is actually Asia. The closest continent to Australia, of course, is Asia. Countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, all of them had the chance to enter Australia later, and many of them, of course, Muslims, especially considering the biggest Muslim country in the world, Indonesia. Australia, as we discussed before, had until September 11, like most of the countries in the world, there was no direct issue about Muslims with Muslims against Muslims. But things changed after September 11, of course, but also after the Bali bombing, which killed 88 Australians. So this affected Australian society much more than September 11, and that's what actually affected the Muslim population in Australia more and more. Although, as we said before, Islam is actually just number 4 in the list of biggest religions in the country, the Buddhists are many more than the Muslims. Buddhism is number 3 and Islam number 4. This, of course, the Bali bombing and everything that had to do with it and everything that followed it, affected, of course, the climate against the Muslims in Australia, and every little thing that the Muslims would say and the Muslim leaders would say would, of course, be taken care of in a different way than other community leaders, so that the Australians would pay attention to the Muslim community leaders from now on. Its neighboring country, Islam in New Zealand. Now, New Zealand is a little bit a different case. You cannot compare the development of Islam in Australia to the development of Islam in New Zealand, although they are pretty close to each other. They're all the way down under on our planet, but New Zealand developed in a different way. It's interesting to see that the first Muslims who arrived in New Zealand were, believe it or not, Chinese Muslims. Chinese Muslims who actually went to find gold in the 1870s. So Islam was brought from China. Chinese Muslims brought Islam to New Zealand, which is a very different case to other countries, as we have seen, and a very interesting one, of course. Now, there were small numbers of Muslim immigrants from India and Eastern Europe as well, who settled from the early 1900s until the 1960s. Within these 60 years, as we have seen migration from all over the world to many big immigrant countries like US, Canada, Australia, now also New Zealand, we see the Muslims followed from India, but also from Eastern Europe. The large-scale Muslim immigration began in the 1970s. The first ones who followed, the ones who had come before already, the Muslims, the ones who became the biggest group then in the 70s, came from a part which many of us, I'm sure, do not even know what it is. They came from the Fiji Islands. The Fiji Islands, you might say, where is that? And are there Muslims there? Yes, the Fiji Islands has a big population of Muslims originally from India. Fiji Islands are islands in the Pacific, and they are not far from Australia and New Zealand, and it doesn't surprise us that many of the people from the Fiji Islands went to find refuge in New Zealand after a coup, and this is something we're going deeper into, inshallah, later. Now, so the Fiji Indians followed in the 70s to New Zealand. The last migratory wave was in the 1990s by refugees from various war-torn countries, such as Bosnia, but also Somalia. As we mentioned before, surprisingly enough, the first Muslims in New Zealand were Chinese gold diggers, and they were working in the Dunstan goldfields of Otago in the 1870s. In the early 1900s, 3 important Gujarati Muslim families came from India, from Gujarat, which is an area in India, and they are the ones who actually established Islamic organizations, and the first one in New Zealand, the New Zealand Muslim Association, and it was established in Auckland in 1950. As we said before, after that, some Muslim men from Eastern Europe especially came with a refugee boat in the 50s, and they, together with the Gujarati Muslims, managed to work together and to buy a house and convert it into an Islamic center in 1959. So basically, the Gujarati Indian Muslims, together with the Eastern European immigrants in the 50s, managed to buy a house and established the first Islamic center in 1959. By that time, of course, in Australia, Islam was settled already for around 100 years. And in New Zealand, they just started. So it was more a recent community that started the process in New Zealand. The first Imam in 1960, a year later after they established the center, the first Imam, Maulana Said Musa Patel, came from India, from Gujarat. So that automatically, with the establishment of the center, the Islam in New Zealand got a little bit this Indian touch, got a little bit the touch from Asia, got a little bit an Indian touch to its Islam and Islamic roots. So that made it again a little bit different to the Islam that we knew in Australia or know in Australia, which got more the Balkan touch, seeing that most of the people came from the Balkan that time. But soon after that also, students from South Asia and Southeast Asia came. So students from areas like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, but also Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand helped establish the other prayer rooms and Islamic centers elsewhere from the 1960s onwards. Although New Zealand had a relatively tiny Muslim population, until many years later, there were some activities that you can see that were going on that time, and it made it the Muslim community an interesting and active part of society, especially during that time that they had to basically establish centers for themselves that were not available, were not there. By 1979, there were three major Muslim organizations which existed in New Zealand, in the bigger cities, such as in Auckland, Wellington, and in Canterbury, and they were all brought together, and I find it a miracle, to be honest, that they managed to bring together all three big associations and organizations to create the one and only national Islamic body, the Federation of Islamic Associations of New Zealand, FIANZ. So they created one federation out of three, brought them together. MashaAllah, I must say, I wonder in which part of the world this is possible nowadays and has ever happened. Seeing that we are so diverse, also in thoughts and in ideology, I find it amazing what they managed to do in New Zealand, MashaAllah. And I think, again, it's a lesson we can learn, I think. The large-scale Muslim immigration that came from the Fiji Islands, as we said before, influenced, of course, heavily the established Gujarat Indian Islam that was basically there already, and changed a little bit the face of Islam in New Zealand. But all this after the break, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
We are the Muslim Ummah, and each day that goes by, the harder we try. In gratitude we pray to Allah. لبيك اللهم لبيك لبيك اللهم لبيك لبيك لا شريك.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. You're not giving it to him because he has black eyes or blue eyes. You're giving it to him because of his position. And that is why you're giving it to this particular department's head rather than giving it to the HR GM, for example. Nobody gives the HR GM anything because they don't want anything from him until they want a job. Therefore, this is the way you can judge whether it's a bribe or not. To get into a halal transaction, first of all, the bank or the financial institution should acquire and own this apartment before any commitment.
لك والملك لك والملك لا شريك لك لبيك اللهم لبيك لبيك اللهم لبيك. The Muslim Ummah, and each day that goes by, the harder we try. In gratitude we pray to Allah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome back after the break. Before the break, we spoke about the difference in Muslim migration to New Zealand and to Australia. We saw that most of the people who went to Australia, the Muslims, came from the Balkan countries, came from the Balkan Peninsula, whereas in New Zealand, the first ones to establish Islam were the Muslim Chinese. And after that, we saw the Gujarat Indians and some Eastern Europeans who worked together and established a masjid, a mosque and Islamic center in 1959, brought a Gujarati imam over in 1960, and then even out of three associations, they made one. So until now, we can basically see that the Muslim communities in New Zealand can clearly be called Muslim community, because until now we can see that they were working together, and there's a kind of cooperation you can clearly see, which in other countries doesn't exist. After the first Fiji coup in 1987 in the Fiji island that I mentioned before, there was a coup in 1987 and many Fiji Indians left. Most of the Fiji Indians were Muslims, are Muslims, and they decided to go to the closest country to find refuge, which was New Zealand. They followed their brethren who were there already in the 1970s, and they were the next ones to come in 1987. Early in the 1990s, many migrants were admitted under New Zealand's refugee quota from war zones that we mentioned before, Somalia, Bosnia, but also Afghanistan, Kosovo, and Iraq. Furthermore, we can also find a significant number of Muslims from Iran who live in New Zealand nowadays. So the community has become a little bit more diverse, especially after the 90s, but it got also a touch of Fiji Indian Islam, especially during the 70s and 80s. But after the 90s, people from very different parts of the world, from Africa and from the Balkan again, during the Balkan Wars, of course, had to come over to move to New Zealand and give it a different touch, give Islam a different face, or give a different face to Islam in New Zealand. It is interesting to see that the concentration of Muslims is mainly in the two bigger cities, in Wellington and in Auckland. We should not forget, New Zealand is basically two big countries, two big islands. It's one country, two islands, but they both have two centers, each one. The one is Wellington and the other one is Auckland. And in both of these cities, you will find the majority Muslims residing there. Auckland, being the largest city of New Zealand, of course, has most of the Muslims. Interestingly enough, also, despite the commonalities that we have seen until now, despite the collaboration and cooperation of the Muslims in that part of the world in New Zealand, we can also see some differences are coming up, especially now. They used to be there where the Muslims used to be Sunnis the whole time. Nowadays, we also see a larger number of Shias who live in the biggest area in Auckland, in the largest city of New Zealand. You will find a bigger community of Shia. And they do celebrate their Ashura commemoration programs in Auckland parks. They do that. And they are also the ones who are visible within the Muslim community. So basically now we can see that there has been a kind of division, in a way, if you want to see it that way, between the one Muslim group that is now Sunni and Shia, who of course came after some of the Shia from Iraq after the war fled, some of them coming from several parts of the world, but mainly from Iraq, who came over to New Zealand, but also from Iran. In 2006, the census of New Zealand 2006 identified 36,072 people who are considered or were considered Muslims, including many New Zealand-born Muslims of varied ethnic backgrounds. Now, we find a number of New Zealand Muslims. We find conversions, of course, also there. Nothing new to that. We have seen in other parts of the world, in the US, in Canada, in South America, in Europe, now also in New Zealand, but also in Australia, quite a number of New Zealanders accepting Islam. Between them, these New Zealanders who accepted Islam, we should not forget, as we have the native Australians, the Aborigines in Australia, in New Zealand, we call the natives Maori. Maori Indians or Maori New Zealanders are the native New Zealanders who were there before the Europeans settled, before New Zealand became a British colony like Australia, and they were the first ones to be there, and it's actually originally their country. The British, again, like in Australia, they settled in Maori land. The Maoris have again realized, like the Aborigines in Australia, the power of Islam, and they have realized, I think many of them have seen that Islam, mashallah, fits more to their way of life and is more a deen that is open to any kind of people, rather, and doesn't have discrimination and doesn't feel racial discrimination and racial differences rather than Christianity or other type of religions. And many of the Maori have accepted, like the Aborigines in Australia, have accepted Islam, and the number is increasing. The small communities of Muslims from other parts of the world that we haven't mentioned before yet in New Zealand are communities coming from Turkey, for example, which is quite a big community in Australia, but it's bigger here. It's quite a community that in New Zealand has a smaller number, whereas in Australia it has a bigger number, of course, of Turks. Then we have some smaller numbers of Pakistanis, Indians, and people from Bangladesh. Furthermore, Southeast Asia and a bit larger Somali community nowadays. It's very interesting to see. We mentioned before that New Zealand accepted from the war-torn areas quite some people, and in between them there were Somalis and Asians. These people, or these communities, are mainly concentrated in the major cities of Auckland, Hamilton, Wellington, and Christchurch. These are the bigger cities, but as I mentioned before, the two big ones are, of course, the main ones. Now, interestingly enough, in recent years, an influx of foreign students from Malaysia and Singapore has increased the proportion of Muslims in some other centers, notably the university city of Dunedin. I would like to mention this one is very interesting because Dunedin is basically the Dunedin's Al-Huda Mosque is reputedly the world's southernmost and is further from Mecca than any mosque in the southern hemisphere. So the southernmost mosque in the world is in New Zealand, in Dunedin, and that makes it very interesting, I think, to be mentioned. As we saw in Australia also, quite some students from Asia came down to New Zealand to study at the universities, but also to learn English. Let's not forget that seeing that English is the only international language and the most important one in the world, students from Asia, of course, opt for the option to rather go to the closest countries that they have, Australia or New Zealand, to study at the universities. There's a big industry of English learning, English as a second language in this part of the world, in Australia and in New Zealand. Quite many universities, quite some private institutes work with people from Asia. Between them, quite some of them Muslims, especially from the Muslim majority country like Indonesia, but also Malaysia, but also Singapore. So we can find quite some students from that part of the world studying English, but also studying at the universities, other subjects that are of interest for where they come from, of course, for that part of the world. Now, we've seen a little bit of Australia and New Zealand is a little bit different. The development of Australia and New Zealand, of Islam, on the spread of Islam in modern Australia and New Zealand is a bit different to some other parts of the world. But we also have seen commonalities to America, to North America, and to Europe. We have seen that during the time of migration, people from all over the world chose to go to these immigrant countries, and many of them were accepted in Australia, in New Zealand, in the US. Australia and the US, of course, have a very diverse Muslim community, or very diverse Muslim communities, whereas New Zealand has a smaller diversity in its communities, simply because the percentage is also smaller, but also because the way that the Muslims came, the groups that came one after the other, was more consistent, more homogeneous. Well, here we have to stop, unfortunately. We've come to the end of the 21st episode, and I would like to welcome you to the next episode, inshallah. I hope you are enjoying this fantastic journey that we have undertaken, and I hope to see you soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
We are the Muslim Ummah, and each day that goes by, the harder we try. In gratitude we pray to Allah. Chosen as part of the best of mankind, we spread the word of Islam. Every difficulty faced in our lives makes us realize that it's just part of Allah's plan. Feeling stronger, we take it in our stride. We are the Muslim Ummah, and each day that goes by, the harder we try. In gratitude we pray to Allah. Chosen as part of the best of mankind, we spread the word of Islam. Every difficulty faced in our life